In fact, researchers, when they wanted to attribute a cognitive trait to animal species or to animal individual, they had first to rule out explanation based on associative learning. And this opposition that is lasting so far to organize cognition on two levels. But recently, some researchers have developed dissatisfaction with this contract, with these sharp contracts. And what they propose is that, first of all, the associative cognitive categories should not be considered as mutually exclusive, and we should consider them as possible integrating each other. And what these researchers propose is the addition of an intermediate level where to locate more flexible, more creative behavior of animal species, and that will show this intermediate level that will be compatible with associative learning explanation, but it also show some marks, some features of cognition, like integration, abstraction, and explicitness. And so the introduction of this intermediate level would be also instrumental to assess the possible functional value or adaptive value of proto-conceptual traits, proto-conceptual, proto-theoretical capacities that might be found in animal species, and clarify, highlight the evolutionary origin of what we call higher order cognition. And here today, with this contribution, we would like to provide some insight on how to conceptualize this intermediate level and how to provide empirical support for it. So before proceeding, before proceeding, I would like to go a little bit more in details on this, what we can call the separatist framing, the two-level cognition framework. According to some researchers working in the field of animal cognition, animals can only learn first-order sensory-motor association. This is not to say, this is not to build any straw man position. They acknowledge that the behavior of animals is more flexible, more creative than previously thought, and then what the model of early behaviorists would have predicted. But at the same time, we don't need, according to them, to introduce any higher order cognition to explain their behavior. Take, for example, the case of the tool use studies, where animals are confronted with different tool challenges. We can explain, according to this researcher, their behavior as only linking rewards to specific actions performing with tools without introducing any abstract concepts such as rigidity or weight and so on. And so to get a little bit more into the context of causal cognition, according to separatists, causal relations are only represented as single effect relations. They cannot be integrated in a way to form more abstract causal representation, and they are mostly considered implicit, non-reportable, and representation that the animal will not access. While on the contrary, only humans use symbolic representations such as word or base nets to represent causal structures linguistically. So humans can talk about causal relations also without direct sensory accesses to the causal mechanism or to the sensorial stimuli that are involved in the causal relation, such as in the case of invisible causes or supernatural causes and so on. And they are, by definition, explicit because they are reportable. And so today we would like to provide insight for this intermediate level by using a specific paradigm, which is the temporal binding paradigm. And so what we will do during this presentation, I will start by describing the temporal binding paradigm, and then suggest how these results, the results that it shows in human adult subjects, can be used to dig into the animal minds through measures of time perception. And I would suggest an experimental, so a series of experiments, and then I will leave the stage to Colin that will discuss the implications of possible positive findings in temporal binding experiments conducted in animals, and the implication for possible features of a representation, of causal representation involved or shown by these experiments, before concluding with novel perspective in evolution and development. So let's start with an explanation of the binding phenomenon. The binding phenomenon, called originally intentional binding, has been discovered in 2002 by Haggard and his colleagues. And the temporal binding shows that mind and causality, time and causality, are connected in our mind, and that this connection affects subsequent behavior. It shows more specifically that under some condition, individuals perceive the interval between two events as shorter than it really is. And it has been firstly discovered in the context of intentional actions and used in subsequent studies as an implicit marker of subjective agency, of the awareness of initiating, executing, and recognizing the effects that the subject itself have produced in the world. So how this binding works, how this effect has been discovered and measured. I'm discussing here the original experiment of intentional binding by Haggard and colleagues in 2002, but I'm not discussing all the conditions that were present in the experiment. I will discuss, for simplicity, only the baseline and the intentional condition. So in this experiment, the subjects were asked to report the timing through a Libet clock in the baseline condition, or only of the voluntary action, which equated to a key press, or the time of the effect, which was a tone. And in the intentional action, they had to report both the voluntary action and the tone together. And what they found is that, so this was compared with other action like Shem, TMS, but for simplicity, as I said, let's not discuss it now. Maybe we can discuss about them later during the Q&A. So what they found is that only during the operant condition, during the intentional action performed by the subject, the perceived time between the action and the effect was shorter. So specifically, the perceived time of the action was shifted forward, a phenomenon that they have called action binding, and that the perceived time of the tone was shifted behind, toward the action itself. So creating this illusion of shortness, we can say. And since then, the temporal binding study has been replicated many times and under variable conditions and with different features. But important for our discussion here is that intentional binding has been also found without intention. So some scientists have used specific machine devices, like what you are seeing here in the slide, to operate on a key press without the action of an agent, of the agent producing the action. And so they have been able to prove, to extend the time, the time compression also in non-agentive, in non-intentional conditions. Specifically, what they do in this experiment is to compare a causal machine condition where the subjects were initiating a machine, producing in turn a key press and then releasing an effect after variable intervals, which was a flash. And this was compared with the self-action, with an intentional action condition, where the subject itself was producing the action and releasing the same effect, the flash, after these intervals. And this a light was simply preceding the flash in time, but it was not causing it. And they found the time compression effect, the binding effect, both in the significantly, both in the causal machine and self-action condition, but not in the correlative condition. And this and other experiments that followed later on does show that even though intentional actions are sufficient for producing this shift in time perception, is not intentional actions are not necessary, while on the contrary, the attribution of causality, of a causal relation, is the necessary factor for producing the effect itself. So after almost 20 years of temporal binding experiments, which now are called in a more neutral way temporal binding and not intentional binding, this effect has been extended also to other conditions. For example, subjects can experience the same time compression or a similar time compression also in a social perspective, proving the effect being allocentric, and during the observations of other action. And other studies have also proved a sort of generalization of the expectation, a phenomenon that here we are calling structural abstraction, and that Colin will explain better later in the second part of the talk. This is to say that binding, so these researchers have shown that the binding effect does not depend on the identity prediction, so on the prediction of a specific effect released by the first event or by the action, because this time compression can also occur with various action effects relations. And finally, another important feature is the awareness of cause-effect relation by the subject. As I said before, intentional binding first and temporal binding later have been used as an implicit marker of subjective agency, of the awareness of the subject of initiating and producing some effect. And in this way, this shift in perception mark a difference with an implicit expectation. So a simple association between two contiguous events that have been experienced earlier. And so what is explicit here is the association or relation for which the subject possesses some awareness, has access to, and can be used for releasing different planning or decision-making processes. So given these features, and relying on these features of temporal binding, so considering that the human psychophysical studies show that causal expectation affect time perception, creating this illusion of temporal proximity. Considering that this effect appears but for agent causal relations or in intentional egocentric perspective, but also in a allocentric perspective with others and with external observed cause-effect pairs, consider that it doesn't occur reliably with merely contiguous events in space and time, and considering that this effect has been extended to condition of that show some abstractness to some extent, and also explicitness of the representation involved in this phenomenon. The question that we would like to ask here is, are animal species subjected to the same illusion? And if yes, under which condition? And can we provide evidence of the causal expectation in animals having the same features that are observed in animals? And so in this way, by asking this question, we think that we can provide some insight for abstracting for introducing this intermediate level of representation that we will elaborate later. So how can we do? We are elaborating, and this is in progress, and we really would like to receive feedback on this. We are elaborating some experimental proposal for testing this phenomenon in animals, because of course we cannot give verbal instructions to animals, and we have to find the different ways to train them. So we are thinking to use psychophysical tests that have been used already in the field, in the context of human temporal binding studies, which is, this test is the synchrony task. So subjects will be rewarded when they successfully discriminate synchronous from non-synchronous events. So events occurring simultaneously or not. And we call this synchronicity judgment. And by training them to do this and putting the subjects in a condition versus a causal versus non-causal condition, we would have this prediction. If subjects possess temporal binding, then their synchrony judgment would reflect the delayed perception of the action binding, and the anticipation of the outcome, so outcome binding, during the causal but not during the non-causal conditions. So how can we do? Here is a possible way to do this with rats. So we are imagining a yoked experiments where there are two samples of individuals, the primary and the yoked individual. They both in the pre-training phase would learn to discriminate synchronous from non-synchronous stimuli. For the synchronous stimuli, so if they hear synchronous stimuli, they will feed on feeder S, and if they successfully discriminate the non-synchronous stimuli, they will feed on the non-NS feeder, so non-synchronous feeder. And the same would happen for the yoked animal. And this would be done with variable intervals between the first and the second stimulus. And after the learning, so the pre-training, they will be inserted in the experimental phase. They will start the experimental phase where only the primary animal is free to produce an intentional action, so pressing on a key, and producing simultaneously the first tone, like T1 or a light or whatever. Here we are imagining an auditory signal. So released simultaneously with the action press, with the key press. And then at variable intervals, variable for the experimenter perspective, there will be also the T2, so that in that way, so the animal, both the primary animal and the yoked animal that is not producing an action, have to judge the synchronicity of the two stimuli. And if the primary animal is experiencing binding, the primary animal would also misjudge more often synchronicity, perceiving the T1 and the T2 more close to each other than the yoked animal. And we can imagine to do this experiment also in a social perspective, where the first, so the yoked animal is able to observe the primary animal and to see whether this allocentric perspective would allow also animals to experience a binding effect. And yes, I think I would finish here and leave the stage to Colin to discuss the implication of a possible finding of temporal binding.
Thanks, Antonella. So I need to share my screen. And let's hope that this works. And I believe you can see my screen now. Very good. So thanks, Antonella. And let me also reiterate my thanks to everyone in Bochum for organizing this opportunity for us to present this work, which is very much in progress. So to emphasize what Antonella just said, we're very much looking forward to getting some feedback and criticism of what we say. And let me also say, who would have thought that somebody would be wishing for a trip to Bochum? But I am. So really wish I could be there in person. All right. So given the experimental setup that Antonella just described, there are 3 or 4 possible outcomes. And that just depends on how we think about the third outcome, is whether we split it. But one possible outcome is that we find no temporal binding in the animals under any of the conditions that are described. A second possible outcome is that we find temporal binding, but no difference between the primary and the yoked conditions. So again, in cases 1 and 2, there's no difference between the primary and yoked animals. The only difference between result 1 and result 2 is finding temporal binding in the second case. And then the third, which could be split into 2 options, is that there is a temporal binding difference between the primary and the yoked animals. And 2 sub-possibilities here is that we find it in the primary subject only, or in the yoked subject only. Now we think that this 3B option is really unlikely, because that would indicate that the animals show temporal binding in the non-causal condition, but not in the causal condition, which would be the exact opposite of what we find in humans. It's a possible outcome, but I'm not going to say very much more about that possible outcome, and really focus on the other 3, and in particular 3A. Also, importantly, thinking about the future development of experimental research on this basis, here I'm just treating the possible findings as discrete. Either we find it or we don't under these various conditions. But it could be that we find it to different degrees. And in fact, even in the human literature, we find temporal binding to different degrees under different conditions. And that will be important, but I don't think we'll have time to talk about that during the formal part of the presentation, but we're happy to bring it up again in discussion. So first, the no binding or no difference implications. So as I mentioned, either of the first 2 findings, where there's essentially no difference between causal and yoke conditions, it would lend support to the view that human processing of cause-effect relations is different from the other animal species tested. And although Antonella described this in terms of rats, one could imagine doing this with any animal species, essentially. And so, of course, you could end up with different findings for different species. But where one finds no difference between the primary and yoked animals, that shows that there's something different going on in humans than in those animals where one finds no difference. Each of these has slightly different implications, though, for thinking about the phylogeny or evolution of cause-effect understanding in humans, or cause-effect processing in humans. So finding 1 would be consistent with a unique or late evolved processing of the causal relations by humans, if no other species shows temporal binding. Or if you find a different distribution then it still will be possible to make some phylogenetic inferences, but humans and other species that show it would be a derived form. And finding 2 would suggest a kind of early evolved or convergent form of associative processing that could have been later co-opted in humans and specialized for causal processing, or it could be a side effect of something else unique to humans. But again, we could make some interesting comparative judgments given a more thorough understanding of the distribution of temporal binding across different species. So the important point then is that different species may have different temporal binding profiles. So regardless of whether or not we succeed in showing that there's some deeper relations between human causal processing and animal causal processing, the temporal binding profile itself is going to be useful for comparative psychology. And we think this introduction of a kind of psychophysical approach to cognitive capacities is a fairly novel suggestion that has not been explored, at least in connection with causal cognition. So what about finding 3A, right? This is the one that we think is probably the most interesting to think about from the point of view of the dispute that has been going on about whether animals have causal processing that's analogous to humans. So if we found 3A, remember, is the finding that some animals experience temporal binding or show evidence of temporal binding under conditions where there is a cause-effect relationship, but not under conditions where there is not a cause-effect relationship. There's a merely associative relationship. So this would lend support for similar processing of cause-effect relations by humans and animals, and would suggest relatively early evolution of dedicated causal representation and processing. So something specific to causal processing. And of particular interest here, I think, for the debate about the kind of capacities of animals that Antonella outlined in the separatist view, the idea is that animals can do sort of first order sensory motor associations, single cause, single effect, but they don't have the capacity to abstract or integrate in any further way. And the finding in the point of doing the yoked experiment is that with the exception of the primary animal's own action, the tones or the stimuli received by the yoked animal are identical in timing to those experienced by the primary animal. And so if there's a difference in temporal binding, it has to be that the same stimuli, right, tone 1 and tone 2, or stimulus 1 and stimulus 2 here, are being placed into different associations than in the 2 different cases, the primary and the yoked animals. So what we have is 2 different representational structures for the same stimuli. The first order association, where there's no temporal binding, may be sequential. It may be that S1 is represented in the particular case as preceding S2. But in the cause effects association, it's definitely sequential, S1 before S2, and temporal binding. Now, it's important also to emphasize an aspect of the training, because the animals in the experiment that we're envisaging get the pre-training on the synchrony task. So we're assuming first that the animals are getting trained on pairs of stimuli that are drawn from a large set of stimuli and have there's no bias in that training set that leads them to always expect S1 before S2. So S2 could come before S1 as well as S1 before S2 in that training set. In the causal condition for the primary animal, in the particular instance where it happens, it does something, S1 appears and then S2 appears, either so close afterwards that it makes a synchrony judgment, or a little bit delayed where it makes a non-synchrony judgment. But we're thinking that in that condition, the intentional act puts it into a causal frame that is not present for the yoked animal when it's not able to observe the primary animal's actions. So guiding this whole area of research, going back to the human intentional binding and then extension to general temporal binding in causal conditions, is a slight modification to a kind of Humean view. In that, and this quote from Blakey, I think, exemplifies it, which is that in this view, the relationship between time and causation is more complex than the Humean view suggests. So not only does the timing of events influence causal beliefs, but causal beliefs themselves also affect our perception of the timing of events. So there's a two-way interaction there, which we think this line of experimentation gets us access to, even in the absence of, potentially gets us access to, even in the absence of the ability of animals to verbally report on their experiences. So the general idea here is that first order sensory motor associations, when they are involving stimuli which may participate in different associative relations, must have more information than the mere fact that one thing is associated with another. And we take it that there's actually quite a lot of evidence from comparative psychology that animals, like humans, are capable of processing pairs of stimuli as participating in various different relations. So, for example, some of these relations are logically unordered. So animals can make adjacency judgments. So A is adjacent to B. That's unordered because if A is adjacent to B, then B is adjacent to A. Same, different, right? So if two stimuli are the same or two stimuli are different, that's also an unordered, you can put either in either position. Or these two individuals are kin or they're not kin, right? That's also an unordered relation. But animals are also capable of various kinds of ordered relational judgments, larger and smaller, before and after, dominant and subordinate. And going to the point that has been charged against some of the experiments of other types, the non-psychophysical experiments done on causal processing in animals. In these non-causal cases, there's a certain amount of evidence that animals are capable of synthesizing a bunch of single relationships into a larger structure. So transitive chaining of ordered relations is within the cognitive capacity of many species. And so the difference is, if you think about transitive inference, A is larger than B, B is larger than C, so A is larger than C. An animal trained on AB and on BC, right, can then make the right selection in an AC choice task. The actual details of the experiment are a bit more complicated than I'm giving here, but the main point is that there are good controlled experiments that show that animals can synthesize a transitive chain from individual relations. And that's precisely what is denied in the causal case, right? So Povinelli and others have argued that animals can do one-by-one cause-effect relations at the first order, but they don't have this capacity to synthesize into larger structures. So we refer to the generic capacity for putting things into putting the same stimuli into different structures as a kind of structural abstraction, because of this fact about the same stimuli can appear in different relations, but also importantly, different stimuli can appear in the same relation. So if you train an animal in same different judgments, it can generalize that same different judgment. Some species can generalize that same different judgment to other stimuli that it was not trained on. So if it's made same different judgments about certain shapes, it can make same different judgments about other shapes that were not in its original training set. So it hasn't learned one by one that the square is the same as the square, the circle is the same as the circle. It's learned this more abstract structural relationship of sameness. Now, that's just to say we think something like a capacity of structural abstraction is present in many species besides humans. And the point of bringing in temporal binding here is that there may be something, a unique signature of structural abstraction to cause-effect relationships. So temporal binding then is that signature, a signature or marker, as we put it in the title, of this structural cause-effect abstraction in humans. Right? There's good evidence of the kind that Antonella outlined for us, that this temporal binding phenomenon tracks not only one's own actions, but the actions of others, so it can be allocentric and so on. And that then provides an empirically tractable signature for comparative studies with non-symbolic, non-linguistic subjects. If the experiment that Antonella outlined and that I talk through the possible outcomes for is doable, then we have a non-linguistic approach to getting at the subject's own judgment of the time interval. And if we found this in non-linguistic creatures, then we think there's evidence for an intermediate level of representation that's between the kind of first order unstructured associations that Penn and Pogonelli thinks animals are limited to, and the kind of symbolic linguistic representations of cause effect that that they hold up as the target that experimenters must show the same kind of capacities as come along with that level of representation. So we have here then a little bit more to say about the alternative intermediate. And here we're picking up on terms, Antonella's already used these terms. These terms also come up from other participants in the literature on causal cognition in animals. What we're adding here is the idea that the psychophysical approach can add to the usual kind of experiments, which often circle around whether animals are able to generalize the use of tools or reason about some contraption. Here, we just want to show, no, there's this marker that actually tracks cause-effect relationships. And then the question of how that corresponds to their ability to perform on these other tasks is a separate question. So if we think about these properties from the perspective of the psychophysical approach, well, we've already explained, or I've already explained why we think that the kind of cause-effect binding, the cause-effect relation being bound with temporal binding is appropriately described as a form of abstraction, what we're calling structural abstraction. We can imagine variants of the basic experiment with different classes of stimuli that could test the range of cause-effect processing across the different modalities in the different species. So, for example, if you've trained an animal on synchrony judgments using tones, you could substitute lights, see if they generalize to making synchrony judgment about flashing lights or about tones and lights. That would show that their synchronous, non-synchronous judgment would be, which we take to be one of those unordered pairings. That would be something that is present in those animals. But then the question is, when there's a causal condition, does the temporal binding phenomenon also generalize across those substitutions of stimulus types? And so that would be what we think of as a modality agnostic form of cause-effect processing, which in the written version of this paper we're calling supramodal, because it's not tied to any particular modality. And it's just an interesting empirical question where this would generalize, assuming we find it. Antonella has also currently already mentioned the notion of allocentricity that can be tested with what I'm calling the transparent yolk variant of the basic experiment. So in the basic experiment, the yolked animal can't see the primary animal. So it's simply hearing the tones that have in fact been produced through the primary animal's action. It doesn't see that action, so it has no evidence that this is anything other than just an arbitrary presentation of two stimuli, such as it had during the training phase. But if we now lift the barrier, put in a transparent barrier, it may be able to recognize that this is in fact a caused sequence, and it would be interesting then if we found temporal binding under that condition. And if we found no temporal binding, then in some species, but we found intentional binding. So when the agent, when the subject is its own agent, right, is the agent of the sequence, then you might find temporal binding. But if not, that would be very interesting for phylogenetic inference. It might suggest, for instance, that intentional binding is a more primitive evolved form than full-scale temporal binding, which can have this allocentric quality. The notion of rationality also comes up in this literature, and Antonella didn't mention it before. I'm not going to say very much about it here, but I'm happy, we're both happy to talk about it in the Q&A. One issue just to mention here is that rationality and the closely associated notion of reasoning has many different definitions in the literature, but even the most skeptical comparative psychologists, so Penn and Povinelli again, allow that animals have some form of causal reasoning at the first order associative level. So we're not going to take, for the moment, rationality is being contested here, although obviously if you want to apply different definitions, you might end up with a different judgment there. And then lastly, explicitness, which I'm going to come and say a bit more about in the next slide or two. That's sometimes equated in humans with verbalizability, as Antonella mentioned. But also, it's generally considered to be related to a kind of awareness of the situation. And I think it's important here to be clear about what the awareness is of. So I take it that humans in a intentional binding or temporal binding experiment are not aware of the fact that the time is compressed, right? They're not aware that they are experiencing an illusory relationship between the cause and effect, right? So the temporal binding itself is not explicit, but in those experiments, they are aware that there's a cause-effect relationship. That's what's explicit. And we think that this notion of the existence of an illusion is relevant to thinking about the relationship between awareness and a point of view. So when temporal binding occurs, it reveals to the experimenter that the subjective perception of time is different from the objective time as measured by the experimenter. And that, as I mentioned, is a kind of temporal illusion. And it thus gives us a way into how things appear to the subject, i.e. the subject's point of view. And that has been used to inform theoretical claims about awareness in human subjects. Again, it's not awareness of the illusion necessarily, but it's awareness of the conditions that produce the illusion. And we believe that similarly, it would be of utility in the animal case. So we think that this psychophysical approach then gives us an inroad, if not something completely determinative, to the four main features of what others have suggested is an intermediate level of representation between the first order sensory-motor associations that Penn and Povinelli think characterize all animal cognition, and then full-blown linguistic or symbolic representation that the separatists deny to animals. So discovering these features and using a psychophysical approach to describe them provides us another route in, separate from the way in which, as I mentioned, these kinds of investigations are usually conducted, where it involves tool use or contraption use. Those experiments all very interesting, but those of you who know some of my earlier work will know that I've also referred to this kind of approach as trophy hunting. You know, it's showing that your animal can do something clever, but it doesn't get at the underlying processing in a very deep way. And I think that there's a long history of using timing relationships to actually understand something about the nature of the processing, and that also then would be a step forward in this area. So does this fully address the skeptics? Well, on the one hand, probably not, because nothing can fully address some forms of skepticism. Particularly when one looks at any individual experiment, it's possible to sort of come up with an alternative explanation from it. And this is just a systemic problem in animal cognition. It's sometimes referred to as the logical problem. There's a lot of interesting things to say about that. But I think we can think of the introduction of the psychophysical temporal binding approach as not necessarily providing a knockdown argument, but as showing new routes to building up a more holistic case for similarity of processing between humans and non-human animals. So discovering a connection between temporal binding and specific representations of cause-effect relations would argue against the two-level account and allow for a more gradual and less dichotomous account. So we take that to be a step towards a more complete, thorough picture of the relationship between human cognition and non-human cognition, one that can still fully realize that humans have unique characteristics, but maybe other species do too. And then, as I've already mentioned, the psychophysical approach provides some information about what is presented to the subject and how it's presented, right? So what is the animal's point of view on this? And how does that affect its behavior? And again, it can be investigated to develop profiles for different species that relate to their ability to deal with causal relations. And then it's possible to say, how would this kind of profile of temporal binding show up in different kinds of more sophisticated behaviors? The high bar that's often set by the skeptics here, where it's reasoning about hidden mechanisms or unobservable properties or allocentric causation. We can see whether or not this phenomenon of temporal binding occurs in these more complex kinds of behavioral tasks. By the way, I think it's worth mentioning here, we haven't said anything during the talk about the experiments by Aaron Blaisdell at UCLA on rats drawing causal inferences. And I'm not going to fully explain the experimental design there, but interestingly, in a later paper, Blaisdell discusses how in a condition where rats have been trained that A cause B cause C, and then presented A without being presented B, they did not go looking for C. But unless the place where B was supposed to appear was visibly covered up, in other words, they knew that they had no information about B, then they would go look for C, C being food, for instance. And so that suggests a kind of capacity for reasoning about a hidden cause, right? Something that is part of the chain but couldn't be seen in that circumstance. When they could see the B stimulus, the light that wasn't covered up, not appearing, the chain was broken and they didn't go looking. So you could look to see whether there was temporal binding in those different conditions. That I think would be a very interesting kind of comparative investigation with many different species. All right, so to summarize here, we have three main points. we think that existing investigation of causal reasoning in animals has been hampered by the standard 2-level account, which sets a high bar to match everything that humans do on the with all of our fancy linguistic symbolic representations. That favors then this kind of separatist skepticism. Okay. And furthermore, I think leads to the kind of trophy hunting experiments that I mentioned. But in this space, we think that temporal binding provides a new psychophysical approach to discovering representations that can be considered explicit representations of the causal relationship and abstract in the structural way that go along with cause-effect relationships. Now, at this moment, it's just a research proposal, but we think it's a promising one to explore further and to really work out what the implications are. And then lastly, this multi-level account, because of the range of variation that one might imagine finding in this middle space, we'll call it a multi-level account rather than 3-level account, opens up space for novel perspectives in evolution and development. And although we haven't talked about development, Antonella's been thinking about this kind of work with human infants, and one could imagine looking at it in development of animal cognition as well. So evolution and development of animal cognition and consciousness of time and causality. So with that, I want to thank you very much and just acknowledge the invitation and support from Volcom, and Antonella spent a year also here in Pittsburgh at the Center for Philosophy of Science, which is where this project started, and Antonella also acknowledges support of the Max Planck Institute. So thank you very much. We'll take questions.